Good evening, folks, and welcome to this presentation of the Border
I
Historical.
got it.
And I hope you enjoy tonight's presentation. It's part of a string of presentations put together by the Border Historical Society, and more especially by the fine efforts of Pam Beveridge, who beats the bushes for speakers to talk on issues on Canadian history or American history or cross-border history, and all those good things. And we sincerely hope you will join us in the Border Historical Society. It is a very reasonable 10 Yankee dollars per year in terms of a membership, and we would love to have you help us to support this speaker series. Tonight, we're very lucky to have a Canadian academic speak to us about Acadian settlement in the Passamaquoddy Bay area. Professor Maurice Basque was born in Tracadie in the Acadian Peninsula of New Brunswick. He is a historian and scientific advisor at the Institut des Études Acadiennes of the Université de Moncton in Moncton, New Brunswick. He published numerous books and articles on Acadian history and culture, and contributed to, get this, a staggering 25 documentary films, which is very impressive. The French government has awarded him the Medal of Officer of the Order of the Palmes Academiques in 2019, following an earlier award in 2003 when France made him Chevalier of the Order of Arts et Lettres. Professor Basque talk tonight will focus on the history of the French presence in the Passamaquoddy Bay area, from the first French settlement on St. Croix Island in 1604 to the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. The career of Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin, Seigneur of Acadian, Passamaquoddy, will be particularly examined. And on that note, Professor Basque, I'll let you go. Would you like the PowerPoint presentation to start now? Or would you like?
We could maybe start with the first image, the first.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your invitation. Thank you. Special thank you to Madame Beveridge. I'm very honored to be here tonight with you. 1 hour later, like many Canadian universities, when we make a talk, we give a talk, we usually start by saying that the land where I am now in Moncton, New Brunswick, is unconceded First Nation land, where the first inhabitants, the Mi'kmaq First Nation, still live. Tonight, First Nations play a very important role, of course, in the 17th and 18th century in that specific border region, in what would later on become New Brunswick on one side, Maine on the other. For most of the 17th and 18th century, there are few European settlements, but it still remains First Nation country, with the population of First Nations being superior to that of the European settlers or European descent settlers. Acadie has a very interesting story. Some of you might know a lot about it. Acadie, the French version of Acadia. Sometimes I remind my colleagues or my students, you know, Acadie starts what I call the Acadian adventure in St. Croix Island in 1604. So that's considered, it's an international island, but it belongs to the United States, to the state of Maine. So it is, I made them squirm a little, saying, you know, Acadie, really is born in the United States, and more specifically in Maine, because of the start on St. Croix Island before moving in 1605 to Port Royal. France, in the colonial empire building world, was not the first nation really to be preoccupied or invest in the new continents. At least that's how the Europeans describe North and South America. Portugal, Spain were really the first. They not only were very much involved in conquering most of South and Central America. The Spaniards pushed even further on Florida. Saint Augustine, as you might know, in Florida, which was founded in the 16th century, is by far the oldest permanent European settlement in North America. France was more interested in the late 16th century by wars of conquest in the Italian states. Italy was not a unified country. It was divided in different duchies, principalities, the papal state. And France, especially under kings like Charles VIII, François Ier, Francis I, tried to conquer at least part of northern Italy. It did not work. And it took time for France, who still has, very important border with the Atlantic Ocean, with the English Channel, with the Mediterranean Sea, to become interested in what was left to a certain extent in the New World, meaning the northeastern part of North America. And when we talk about that northeastern part of North America, usually academics, historians, the women and men interested in the history of that region, they give a very, very large definition of northeastern North America, going almost from Virginia to the Great Lakes up to Labrador and Newfoundland. It's a big chunk of the continent that is known for researchers and academics as Northeastern America. France did send a few expeditions in that area in the first half of the 16th century. One of those expeditions was conducted by an Italian explorer. You know that Italian explorers, we share that in common with our American neighbors. It was an Italian explorer who gave his first name to America, Americo Vespucci, and it was an Italian explorer, Giovanni da Verrazzano, who not only gave his name to a bridge, but he also was the first in 1524 to inscribe on a map, probably on the region of Washington, D.C., Maryland, the name Arcadia. Arcadia, which is still today a region of Greece, but was also known as a mythical region where almost paradise on earth, where you wouldn't work a lot, you would have enough to eat. It was celebrated by the poets of the Renaissance, and probably that Giovanni da Verrazzano had some of the Renaissance culture, probably read some poems at the time, singing the beauties of Arcadia. So his Arcadia, gradually, when they copied maps from one person from one cartographer to another cartographer, the name Arcadia sort of migrated from the Maryland, Washington, D.C. area to what is now known as the Maritime Provinces of Canada. From Arcadia, we got l'Acadie in 2 words, and then it was Acadie that became the standard spelling of Acadie, so Acadie, Acadia in English. For a long time, though, the people would refer to what would become the Acadians in French as Cadiens without the A. So when they arrived in Quebec after the Acadian expulsion, they would, the Quebecois in their language would refer to the Acadians sometimes as Cadiens. And of course, when they later on arrived in Louisiana, that Cadien was the ancestor, if you will, of the word Cajun that is now associated with that very dynamic musical and other aspects of the culture in Louisiana. We know that some French explorers were in the Bay of Fundy. The Europeans, and we still do the same when we go in space. We give names to places where we were never. Very few places kept their First Nation names. The French called the Bay of Fundy La Baie Française, the French Bay. And eventually it became the Bay of Fundy. Probably some of those ships entered Passamaquoddy Bay in the late 16th century. We know that there were many hundreds of ships in the late 16th century fishing off the Great Banks, the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Ships from the Basque country of Spain and France, French fishermen, boats from the region of Brittany, which is the peninsula, and with the very vibrant culture of that region of France. English boats also with Irish sailors. Fish was a very important part of the European diet. In Catholic countries, even now, there's a tradition, Friday you eat fish. And even when the Protestant Queen, Elizabeth I of England, maintained the obligation of eating fish on Friday so that the fishing industry of England would not be compromise with the Protestant Reformation, where people were abandoning some Catholic practices. So France is not officially really in the area of the Grand Banks, mostly fishermen, and fishermen that won't tell really where they went when they arrived back in Europe. In the last decades, historians have found proof that they were present before the 1604 expedition that settled on St. Croix Island. How do they do this? Well, they went through old records like in monasteries where the people in small fishing villages of Brittany and France would pay what they owe to the church with cod, with dry cod or salted cod, and the monks would note on their documents, this fish is from les terres neuves, from the new lands. So it is a good indication that it was not just cod caught off the coast of Brittany, off the coast of Spain or England or Ireland. It was really from what was already known as Newfoundland. I was talking earlier, then the Basque, for instance, were very present with cod and also hunting whales. Well, the whale, the oil of the whale, the meat, they had settled not permanent establishments, but certain posts up to Labrador, where they would melt the fat and some of the Basque words entered some of the First Nation groups there that still have those Basque words today. Henry IV of France, after a bloody civil war, the religious civil war between France, between the Protestants and the Catholic in France, himself was a Protestant. He was the only heir to the French crown. He conquered almost all of France, and the last city to really resist him was Paris, capital of France, and he famously said, by converting to Catholicism, that Paris was well, how should I say? Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is well worth a mass. Huh? So I'll go to church, I'll convert. But he kept a lot of his Protestant friends, Protestant networks who fought on his side during the Civil War. And one of his, at least someone that he really knew well, who was one of his colleague officers, was Pierre Dugas, Sieur de Mont. France became interested in the late 16th century by the possibilities of the fur trade. Fur was not the first product that the French were looking for, like Europe, like Portuguese, like the Spaniards. They believed that in northern, in the part of northeastern America, North America, you would find silver and gold. Of course, that was not the case, but they find a product which was very well worth the investment, the fur. Why the fur? Because fur was getting more difficult to get from Russia at the time, and the big hats that the gentlemen and the ladies were wearing with the feathers that were very much in style for most of the 17th and 18th century, even the top hats later on, beaver fur was the preferred fur as the original product in the process of creating those hats. So the fur that you could get from the First Nation hunters would have like a profit of 300% when it was brought back in Europe and sold to the different merchants, to the different makers of hats. Coming back to de Mont, Henry IV, in an officially Catholic country, proposed the creation of a private company that will go to what would become Acadie and colonize it. And in that, those investors in return would have the monopoly of the fur trade for 10 years. Was a very interesting business. Even Dutch investors invested in that company. The Dutch were really the first in Europe to create the notion of a private company, not really a state-run company, but more private interest. So at least 20% of the investors in that French company that was put together to try to settle the New World with French pioneers, 20% at least of the shares were owned by Dutch investors. Henry IV, as King of France, gave the leadership of that expedition to his colleague, Pierre Dumont, who stayed a Protestant, a Huguenot. De Mont never converted to Catholicism. And De Mont brought with him a cartographer that would become very famous, not only in Acadie, but mostly in Quebec, of course, Samuel de Champlain. In the United States, also in the state of New York, the state of Vermont, I believe. There's a big lake that bears his name. Henry IV almost had a sort of a dream to try, if Protestant and Catholics could not really get together and live together in France, maybe they could live together in the New World peacefully. So he decided that on that expedition that arrived in the New World in 1604, there would be a Catholic missionary and a French Protestant minister. So he had both present in that first expedition that settled on Sainte Croix Island. But unfortunately, those two men did not really give the example of harmony. They fought all the time during the long voyage to cross the Atlantic. They fought about theology. They fought about who was right, who was going to hell, who was going to heaven. The men had enough of their arguments. So eventually, when they died, they decided to bury them one next to the other, saying that if they could not get together in this world for eternity, they will have to be together because they're buried together in the same tomb. At least those men had a sense of humor like so many countries at the time, the new versions of Christianity with the older versions of Catholicism was really a very important subject of discussion. They arrive in Sainte Croix Island. It is, when we look at Sainte Croix Island, very, very small island, they thought that it would be easy to defend as an island, that if there were people, other merchants, maybe privateers in the region, maybe pirates, even First Nations, they did not know what they called the Indians at the time. Were they going to be friendly or hostile? So that island seemed like a very strategic place to settle, at least for a few months. They built an open settlement. Some of the buildings were like prefabs. Some of the building parts had already been built in Europe and were transported on the ships, so they could put them together real fast. We have lots of information on those few months on Sainte Croix Island. Marc Lescarbot, a Parisian lawyer who really liked the idea of living in the new world, he was like an idealistic person, said that the name was probably given of Sainte Croix because of the different embranchments of the river that was baptized Sainte Croix, because it looked like a cross, croix meaning cross, of course, and the settlement on the island, those French men did not know that that part of North America at the time was going through a small period ice age. Snow started to fall in October of 1604, and it didn't go away. Samuel de Champlain wrote in his very detailed memoirs, books that he published about his presence and maps of the region. We can maybe go to another slide and see, it's a very well-known illustration of Champlain's drawing of the Sainte Croix Island in 1604 with the little houses. They were living together in maybe the next one. Where is it? Maybe the next. We can start with the. I'm sorry about this. Yeah, we're gonna go almost there. There you go. A very well-known illustration when you are interested in the history of Maine, Acadie, that 1604 drawing of Samuel de Champlain. Samuel wrote that the only thing that did not freeze during that winter of 1604-1605 was wine from Spain. So Spanish wine got a good reputation by keeping, and they did not have any fresh water. They could not cross to the mainland because of the ice that was not really strong enough. Many people died of scurvy, of course. We're lucky to have, as historians, the documentation of some surgeons that were present that made some autopsy and that they were trying to understand what was going on with the men who were dropping like flies. More than half of the men died of scurvy. They were rescued in the spring of 1605 by probably the members of the Passamaquoddy First Nation, who must have had a big laugh saying, what are those people doing on that small island during winter with no game to hunt, with no fresh water, so that they would exchange meat with those French entrepreneurs. They settled in Port Royal, Port Royal in Nova Scotia the following year, a more temperate climate. But the region was not forgotten by the French. They sent expeditions trying to get the groups of First Nations to be allied with them, friendly with them. The fur trade, the first period of the fur trade in North America was most of the work was done by First Nation hunters. They were the ones who would get their canoes or hunt during the winter time, because it's during the winter time that animals with fur, like the moose and especially the beavers, their fur is at its best. It's shiny, it's thicker, I'm not a hunter, it's healthier. And though that period of the year was the period where they would hunt, kill a lot of moose, of beavers, and then bring them back to the trading posts that the French established at the estuary of the river, like the St. John River. And the idea with the settlement on St. Croix Island was it was actually in that region, in the estuary of the river, where when spring came, they would receive canoes filled with fur, and then they would exchange with the First Nations. Champlain, as one of the leaders of the expedition, became a bit frustrated with the Acadie settlements, trading posts. He decided to move on to the St. Lawrence Valley. And of course, he founded another settlement, another trading post that became a city, the capital of New France. In 1608, 1 year after the founding of Jamestown in Virginia, he founds Quebec. Quebec, from that date on, becomes the center of interest for the French governor, the French investors, the French settlements with religious congregations, people settling there. You can still see in old Quebec City real traces of that French colonial presence. Acadie becomes more or less sort of a second fiddle in the mind of the deciders of the French colonial empire in that part of what would become Canada. It still is important, but not as much as what they will find in the New World. An island which is not in actually Passamaquoddy area, but Mount Desert, which is still an important island off the coast of Maine, had its name in French Mont Désert, meaning that the small mountains on the island were deserted at the top, meaning that they had no trees on the top. That's why one French explorer named the island Mount Desert. That island received a very small Jesuit presence in 1613. Jesuit priests became really interested and really much involved in the colonial presence in both Americas. And in Acadie, like they would be more important afterwards in Quebec, in the Great Lakes area, they would try to impose their views of how trading with First Nations should work, instead of trying to convince First Nations people to convert and found a permanent village around the European settlements. They would go to the villages of the First Nations, live amongst them, learn their language, and they tried to impose a condition when a trading condition that the French traders hated. They said, if a First Nation hunter warrior wants a gun in exchange for the furs that he gets, he has to convert to Catholicism first. The English traders in New England had nothing to do with that part. They were mostly Protestants. They were there for the business. Even the guns that they were trading with the First Nations in New England, some in Maine, were of better quality than those that the French had, because they were made in Sweden. Sweden at the time was producing the best muskets, guns on the European market in that early 17th century. So French traders hated the presence of the Jesuit. That's why the Jesuits left Port Royal in 1613. They created that little settlement on Mont Désert with some of the converted First Nation. That settlement, with the one in Port Royal, was destroyed in 1613 when Samuel Argall arrived in the region, coming from Virginia with a mandate of getting rid of the French presence in that area. There was already a start of one of the numerous English attacks on the Acadian settlements, which would last until the Acadian expulsion of the 1750s and early 1760s. Where Jean Sureau de Saint-Aubin comes into the picture, he's a French man from the Poitou region. The Poitou region is located in central Western France, and many, we believe, of the Acadian surnames that still are present today are probably originated from the Poitou region. There are lots of how should I say, in the French language, the way that we pronounce certain words, certain expressions are still used in that region. It's very difficult when you are trying to do your family history in Acadie with Acadian names, because a great deal of the first French people who settled in Acadie came from regions of France who were devastated by religious civil wars. And one of the first casualty of those wars were the parish registers from the Catholic churches parish registers from the Protestant temples were burned down at the same time that the buildings were burned down. So it's very hard to find, to link your family to the first who left from France. Jean Sereau de Saint-Aubin arrives in Acadie when Acadie is starting to receive more interest from the French government in the 1640s. He is probably not a real nobleman, but he's not a laborer, he's not a worker, probably will come here mostly as a soldier, tries to make a living like those middle, what we call maybe now middle class people that had a hard time of making a better living in France. The New World was sometimes seen as a maybe more opportunity to move up the social ladder, something that was almost impossible in France at the time. You would always, with few exceptions, stay in the group at the level where you were born. Born the son of a butcher, probably a butcher yourself. Born the son of a lawyer, probably a lawyer yourself afterwards, or an officer of the law. The church was almost one of the rare major institutions that gave the possibility to some brighter young men from more common classes to rise in the society. They were at the time even seen as exceptions when compared to the others. Higher positions of the Catholic Church at the time were mostly occupied by noblemen that inherited it from their uncle, who was a bishop, an archbishop, the abbé of a monastery. The nephew would get after probably the charge, and that stayed for a long time. Jean Sereau de Saint-Aubin is interesting because he will play a very important role in the Passamaquoddy area in the late 17th century. But he starts first his career in the New World in Acadie, in Port Royal, and then at the mouth of the St. John River, where there's a little trading post, fortified trading post, owned by Charles de Saint-Étienne de La Tour. La Tour is the arch rival of another French official in Acadie, Charles d'Aulnay. The two men will fight it off almost to the death. D'Aulnay will die first. La Tour will spend some time in Quebec before coming back to Acadie. There's an interregnum from 1654. In 1654, the English take over Acadie for a second time, and this time they will be there for maybe 15, 20 years. It's not a very well documented part of Acadian history, but a very important one, where the few French settlers have to deal with new English masters. Probably some of them will learn the English language. The English language in Acadie has a very long history, longer than with our neighbors in Quebec, where the English language had not the same impact. Most of the Acadian elites before the Acadian expulsion could at least understand some words. Many Acadians were chosen by the English, then the British, to be official translators when they were writing peace treaties with the First Nations. Even some Acadian women who had First Nation blood, who could speak French, understand English, and speak a First Nation language like Passamaquoddy, were chosen by the British to be official interpreters for the official treaties that the British signed with many First Nations in the 18th century in the bigger region from Penobscot to Nova Scotia before the final military contest and war that marked the end of colonial Acadie. Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin would go back to France with trouble. He came back in the 1660s with a wife, Marguerite, and they settled in the Isle of Orléans, l'Île d'Orléans. Maybe it's the last slide. L'Île d'Orléans is a very well-known island in the St. Lawrence Valley, not far from Quebec City, a huge touristic attraction, beautiful old houses, churches that date back to the 17th century, one of the oldest permanent French settlement in the New World. If ever you visited it, it's a very beautiful place, nice restaurants, and it was really occupied and divided very rapidly by the first French settlers who wanted to live on that island, of course, much bigger than the Sainte Croix Island. The lands were prosper for farming, beautiful views and everything. So it became very central in the peopling of New France, the French settlement. Jean Serrault was there before arriving back in Acadie. He had a very, how should I say, colorful path. His wife, Marguerite, was younger than him. That's not exceptional at the time. And on the Orléans, the Île d'Orléans, the island, he and her were neighbors with a few single men from Switzerland who were there and who were not yet married. And he found out that his wife, Marguerite, was having an affair with one of those Swiss single guy, Jean Terne. Very violent discussion broke out. She asked to leave the house and to try to settle elsewhere, not to be tempted by this Swiss single man. They tried sort of a separation for a few times, but it never really worked because every time that she came back, he found her and Jean Terne in not very, should I say, especially at the time, in very scandalous situation. And it finished in 1685, where he killed his wife lover. So he was pardoned. He had good links with the local government and with the royal court. But eventually, his wife would leave him again, this time to settle with what was known at the time as the equivalent of a prostitute in Quebec City. There are very detailed documents of the dealings of those both women, causing a great scandal in Quebec. And Jean Serrault was sort of made out of a laughing stock. So he decided to move with the family. They had children together, even if they were fighting a lot. And he moved to Acadie, and this is where he got the seigneurie. He had a large land grant in the Passamaquoddy area, and it was called a seigneurie. The way that the French wanted to settle the New World was to use the same land owning system that they had in France. All the land should be owned by the seigneur, which was not always noblemen, but more of a leading social group. And if you build the pyramid, the real official landholder of French territory was the king. But if you go down the pyramid, the seigneur would be at the local level. Seigneur had privileges, but they had responsibilities. They had to build a mill. They had to invest to build a Catholic church and to bring people to settle in their seigneurie where they would give some land. This is how Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin is known to have lived in that area of the Passamaquoddy for a few years. And he was one of those special singers who was known at the time in French as les seigneurs des sauvages, the singer of the savages, meaning that the most important group on their seigneurie was First Nation. In this case, the Passamaquoddy, with whom Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin had really friendly relationships, friends, partners probably in trade. Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin, instead of growing wheat or trying to get some French families to settle in his seigneurie, was mostly out fishing cod with his sons, probably also with some First Nation men from the Passamaquoddy region. And we know of at least one French man that lived on the seigneurie on an island with under the leadership of Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin. His family name was LaTreille. LaTreille was one of the only French man with his family that was settled in that region, compared to the seigneuries in the St. Lawrence Valley, which were more developed, had more families, were more successful in cultivating wheat and other agricultural products. The very little small seigneuries in late 17th century, what would become Maine, were more geared to fishing cod, selling cod to European ships that would cross once a year to try to get most of the cod they could to go back and sell it to the European markets, selling furs also, not in huge quantities. So those seigneurs des sauvages, which were sometimes known also as capitaine des sauvages, captain of the savages, would be wearing almost the same clothes as the First Nation. You would find them in the woods, and you would distinguish that he was white, but he would be wearing clothes made out of animal skin or animal furs, hunt like a First Nation, and be very close to them. Like another more known French figure in Maine's history, who gave his name to the settlement of Castine, the Baron de Saint-Castin. Saint-Castin arrives in Maine, what would become Maine in the 60s, 70s, marries a First Nation woman, the daughter of a renowned Passamaquoddy Abenaki chief, and he has children with her. Those children, sons and daughters, marry into other Acadian families, leading Acadian families, leading Acadian families in Acadie. One of my ancestors is from one of those women. There's a book written by Bonnie McBride, Woman of the Dawn, very interesting book where she explores those women that belong to two worlds, belong to the European world by their marriage to a white man, a French man, but also, of course, to the First Nation world, being themselves born, speaking the language, learning another language, and most importantly, acting as very important political bridges between creating alliances, defending them, transmitting their bilingual culture to their children, who then can also talk French, Passamaquoddy or Malicite or Abenaki languages, some English. So few players, but very important, crucial players. And this is where those women emphasize the roles that they play. Again, sometimes we have a tendency to just say, the Baron de Saint-Castin, or a few white men who were like the principal actors of the time. We forget that they are acting at the same with the almost the permission of the majority group at the time, who were the First Nations, and their wives and their daughters played so much of an important role. Bonnie McBride, I think, did a great job with her book, Women of the Dawn, trying to explain what it is. Finally, Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin would have built sort of a small trading post, maybe a fort. Unfortunately for him, his wife is still with him. Not that that's not the unfortunate part. Unfortunately for him, his fort, his trading post, is attacked a lot of times by English privateers or by English official military expeditions that come from Boston. Boston, Massachusetts wants to expand its territory in an official way, looking at pushing back what appears to be an unofficial border between New France, Acadie, the French colonial empire, and the English colonial empire. Will the border be the Penobscot River? Will it be the St. Croix River? Of course, the two camps have not shared, have no common view of those borders. And again, I must stress, we are in presence of a First Nation territory. The Abenakis try to live by using both the advantages of having conflicting European colonial powers. Culturally, they're more linked with the French, being baptized, wanting Catholic missionaries, many of them speaking French, having some of their family members, women, married to some leading French men. But economically, they want to be linked with the English of Massachusetts for better trading products, for guns, metal objects, and they're stuck between these two enemies. And Serrault de Saint-Aubin, he will know the same fate as so many of the French who from Acadie will, the few who settled in the Passamaquoddy area in that part of the 17th century, many times their buildings, houses, trading posts will be burned down. Their boats for fishing will be confiscated. Sometimes women are raped when they're when there are some attacks. Some of them are taken prisoners in Boston. You have to pay an amount to get them free. And it's, if you want to build, if you want to stay there, you have to rebuild all the time. It's a different situation, because the English trader of today becomes the English military invader of tomorrow, meaning someone like Benjamin Church, who's from Massachusetts, is not only a military leader that's very important at the time in the second half of the 17th century for Massachusetts, Maine, and Acadie, but he's also a trader. So the villages that he will destroy, or the trading posts that he destroy, he knows them well. He might have been in the place the year before, trading furs, buying fish in exchange for guns and other products from Europe. So it's a very complicated situation for actors of European descent and First Nation actors who live in these borderlands. The role that Saint-Aubin plays, he finally dies in Port Royal in 1705. An old man, very discouraged that all that he has tried to build in the Passamaquoddy region has been burned to the ground, destroyed by these English attacks from Massachusetts. But it's an example of how empires, from Versailles in France, from Whitehall in London, from European governments, from colonial important capitals like Boston, try to reach and even control, which is at the time the farthest borderland people, even if there are only a few. They become the very few representatives. Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin for the French becomes the only most representative of French authority, of the French claim to that region in the late 17th century. Final information, there's also more travels than we thought of for years. It is not very well taught in schools that in New France, almost 2/3 of French who crossed the ocean went back to France. They couldn't stand the winter, and I can understand that. They couldn't stand the attacks from the First Nations. They couldn't stand the mosquitoes that they don't have in France, big mosquitoes. They just wanted to cross the ocean again. Some were very scared to cross the ocean back because the trip was horrific, and they stayed in the New World, but it was not their first choice as settlers. So you have this back and forth by many people in the 17th century, crossing back and forth. Champlain maybe made the trip 30 times, which is almost a record. In one of his trips to France, Serrault de Saint-Aubin went to Versailles, which was just opening as a new palace with all the glitter, the gold, the crystal. He met the king, Louis XIV. They had a conversation, and the king gave him sort of a document, again, sort of excusing him for bad behavior decades earlier and sort of confirming his role as a singer in 17th century Acadie. This is, as a conclusion, sort of a life. It's an exceptional life, but it illustrates the different challenges, problems that you could have. A wife cheating on you many times, killing your wife's lover, getting out of it, making bankruptcies a lot along the way, having children, living with a different culture, living in the Passamaquoddy people land with their customs, with their way of looking at the world, trying to find your own way when you're in the middle of fighting empires like France and England, later on Great Britain. And I like to see in Jean Serrault de Saint-Aubin almost an illustration of what the Acadians tried to do before 1755. They tried to create a world that was their own, but finally it exploded in 1755 with the Acadian expulsion. It was a creation that could not keep up, that was not strong enough when push came to shove and the two major empires wanted once and for all to find a military solution to what would be the French presence in New France, with the loss of New France and the conquest of New France and what would become Canada in 1763. Thank you for your patience. English is not my first language. I had a unilingual Anglophone grandmother when I was young. I was very fortunate. So we learned a lot with her. I teach, of course, our university is one of only 2 universities in the maritime provinces, which is only in French. But we study, we don't study enough the history of our neighboring state, and we, like so many other cultures, when we look at the St. John River, we don't see it as if it was shared by another country or as if it belongs to Acadie. And it's the same thing with Sainte Croix. You cannot really go on Sainte Croix Island. It's protected. But we rarely see it as an American island. When we teach history, it's seen as the starting point of Acadian history and not belonging to as to quote Bruce Springsteen, born in the USA. That's part of the Acadian story from the start. So maybe we can get him to our next Acadian World Congress in Nova Scotia as an opening act with that song. I don't know how many of my Acadian friends would enjoy it, but they have to face the fact Sainte Croix is where it is, as it always was. Maybe you have questions or comments?
Yes, if anybody has a question, feel free to chime in. We'd love to have some questions.
Josh, could you go through the slides, and if the professor sees something interesting, he could point it out?
Sure.
Yeah, like the one before, the map.
Oh,
The just with the blue color, the blue, blue, red, and that other color. The map with 1654, something like that, 1630.
got it. A second.
So
I'll get you there.
There's Ile de Leon.
One.
My computer is not cooperating. Hold on.
Not that one. Not that one.
This one.
Those ones. Yeah, there are 2. Yeah, you see how the I'm going to bring my phone next to my. You see how on that map, France had a bad. Had not a very and not only in France, but they had a very limited knowledge of what the New World looked like and how the maps were not that precise. So at what time they gave they divided in Acadie in between 3 seigneur entrepreneurs. They gave the grayish region to Nicolas Denis with Canso. He was also a French, very important French player in Acadie in 17th century. He stayed with the Micmacs. He hunted with them. They called him Grand Barbe, long beard, which is probably the fact that he had a long beard. And France tried to get Charles de la Tour and Charles d'Aulnay, the 2 major players at the time who were fighting each other, to get along. But what they did, they gave one area of, how should I say, of influence to one singer. So part of Maine, part of where you are, was given to Charles d'Aulnay. But Charles d'Aulnay's headquarters were in Port Royal, which was in the territory of his enemy. And France, to continue the mixed up, gave his enemy the land in Nova Scotia surrounding d'Aulnay's headquarters, and d'Aulnay's land had in its almost middle the headquarters of his enemy, which was Fort Sainte-Marie, which is in the region of the city of Saint John right now in New Brunswick. So from the start, John Reed, a Canadian historian who teaches colonial history, one of the great Canadian historians teaching history at the St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, wrote a very important book which has Maine, your region of Maine in it in the 17th century. And he called the book Acadia, Maine, and New Scotland, marginal colonies in the 17th century. Marginal colonies because they were still fragile. They were not strong colonies like Virginia, like Massachusetts, who had a population base, an economical base, capitals, even the valley of New France, the St. Lawrence Valley. Acadie, Maine, the Scots tried to get something on in Acadie in the middle of the 17th century. It didn't work. So the 17th century for our larger region was very much a region of great challenges and redefinition lots of times without that solid base where Europeans could look at and say, well, we have a permanent administration, there's an economy that is working well, that can supply the colony, and the colony cannot be autonomous, but at least the colony could feed itself, which for Acadie, it took a long time before the agriculture became something more of a permanent and prosperous sector. We have to wait until the first half of the 18th century to have that Acadie that's been described in Longfellow's poem Evangeline, where you read descriptions of fields, of animals, of prosperous peasants that are at ease. It's not really that reality in 17th century Acadie. And the northeastern part of Maine also has a lot of challenges with authority that's contested between Massachusetts, New France, Acadie. They have to. There's a story of the people in Port Royal, Nova Scotia, which was the capital of Acadie in the late 17th century. There were so much use of having attacks from the English that they had two flags. If the ship arriving in port was French, they would raise a French flag. But if the ship had English colors, they would rise the English flag, saying, well, 10 years ago, we pledged loyalty to the English crown. So almost, please don't burn us down this time. So it really makes, it really gets into your mind, creates a very peculiar culture of political neutrality if you want to survive in the new land.
Mm.
Well, let's see if we can find some more images. I think people, this is the
St. Croix Island.
Okay.
This is the diorama they have at the park.
Yes. See, there were gardens, there were Swiss guards. There's a little house drawn by Champlain that says in French, the house of the Swiss. But it was not, sometimes we say it was a colony. We have to be very careful with words. There were no women. And there were no women, French women also in Port Royal for years. So, they created the Order of Good Cheer in Port Royal to go, to have the winter, to see the winter through by having good food, drinking, playing music, but no families. Families were, of course, the key to the French and the English presence. At a certain point, the King of France, Louis XIV, encourage the soldiers from the French regiments who he sent to New France and Acadie, will give you land if you marry and settle down there, to create an attachment. Single men, men who are not married, were not to be seen almost as trusted. And even in New France, if you were a single man, you had to pay a special tax because you were a celibate. So there was a lot of incentive for you to get married and have children and stay in the colony, because the administrators knew that, like I was telling you, so many people crossed the Atlantic but couldn't stand it and crossed back. They could not stand especially in New France, the new condition of their new life.
There we go. And this is the same place. This is St. Croix Island as well. With a
Yes.
Yeah, there's the Champlain. That's part of the Champlain drawing with the gardens. You see the houses with the letters, and each letter has a description on the side. When they moved in 1605, instead of having the little houses with no protection, they created what they call an habitation, a single little fort that becomes what has been rebuilt in Port Royal, Nova Scotia, as Champlain's habitation. You enter it, it's surrounded by walls, wooden walls. You have a central court, and the housing are like apartments, units that all give in the central court. You have the first apothecary that came to New France, Louis Hébert, that started taking notes on what he was finding in the New World with the plants that did not exist in France, getting information with the First Nations to how and what did they do with these plants for certain sicknesses. What is not funny, but one of the first comments that we think that we would hear from the First Nations when they see European building permanent houses would be, what are they doing with houses that they can't bring from one place to the other? They were living in wigwams that they could build, disassemble, assemble, move all the time. So why are the Europeans doing with houses that don't move? What's going to happen when they don't have any game left in this area? What's going to do? And when Champlain leaves Port Royal to settle Quebec with another habitation, well, when you see the style of habitation, structure, architecture in Quebec in 1608, it's a big, huge, big building which is fortified. So you see that even if many Quebec historians don't recognize that, you see that Champlain, along the way from St. Croix Island in 1604, 4 years later in Quebec City in 1608, he's learning how to build in the New World, concentrate for defense, and of course, wintertime, that you don't have to go outside that many times from one place to another. So you'll have, again, these big habitations, which was the base of what would become Quebec City later on.
So in this image, that sure looks like an English vessel that's off St. Croix Island, right? Is that the Cross of St. George?
No, that's the flag of the French Navy. I wrote a little book on the history of the Acadian flag, and at the time, it's a bit confusing. The navies have specific flags, which is not the same flag as the English flag. The French flag for a long time was only white, which is the color of the monarchy. That's why we have white in the middle of the French flag today, which with the star becomes the Acadian flag. You have the cross of St. George that is on some English boats, but many of the French merchants and then the French regiments, military regiments, you'll have a blue cross with 4 different sections. That's what inspired Quebec with its flag, with the fleur-de-lis in the 4 parts. They took for their flag that was created in the 1940s, the inspiration from the royal period of the French present, the colonial period. But Acadians, when they chose their flag in 1884, they chose the Republican flag, which is a bit quirky because the flag was created by a Catholic priest at a time where the Republicans in France were not really good friends with the Catholic clergy, but that's another story. But that's why you see that cross on the flag.
Well, let's see. I think. Tell us about this. Is this one of your slides, or is this something that somebody else?
This is Madame Beveridge. These are the French cellars. Those are the ones I'm not very familiar with. There's, as I was saying, there's some archaeology that has been done recently. It's difficult with the French presence of that time, of that period, because it was destroyed so many times with so many fires that you have sometimes different levels of ash that appears. And when you see ash, I'm not an archaeologist, but it's a good indication that the house was burned down or that something happened. So, you know, one of the major, it's not a difficulty, but it's unfortunate. One of the major challenge that we have is that we have to rewrite the history books by including much more the First Nation presence and not looking at the border with 21st century eyes as if it was a dividing factor, which it was not in the 17th century. That world was very open, boats circling, marriages being done, people being attacked, kidnapped, ransomed, but commerce being done also. It's a challenge, but it should be done for a better understanding of we share the same region. It's and again,
This
see,
is
I
the
learned
island
that. Yeah, I
that
learned that.
LaTreille lived on.
Yeah, I learned that Eastport for a long time was the second busiest port after New York on the East Coast. And it's so close to my province, but it's not part, and my historian, it's not part of, you know, what I imagine of Maine, you know. I was raised partly on Stacy's Country Jamboree, which my aunt really enjoyed.
Is Indian Island, and that is where Nicholas LaTreille lived on this island. In fact, Indian Island was once called LaTrelle's Island, which is a corruption of LaTreille.
Yeah.
And on that slide of Eastport with the red mark, I'm sorry, that was an image I stole from a real estate. That is some land for sale. That's not showing where the French cellars are.
Okay.
But that is the north end, and that is supposedly where they were located.
Okay. See, we have a big, in New Brunswick also, not only the First Nations, but some Acadians have to fight a lot. We don't have a law like in France. In France, if you dig, you have to give the archaeologist time before to do their business. Then you can start construction. Here they can bulldoze, and you know it's too late. There's the permit was given, and there's no. We're like Maine, which is not a super big state. We're not a super big province, so we don't have a big archaeological staff. But we're losing a lot of artifacts, especially First Nation artifacts, when they're bulldozing through former cemeteries. It's not a good thing to see.
Well, let's see if we have any other. Okay, did Campobello have Acadian settlements?
Not really. It was more when the English, more British arrived, especially the Loyalists. The Loyalists, I was explaining that on the radio yesterday, because yesterday was the anniversary of the landing of almost 3,000 Loyalists on the 18th of May, 1783, in what would become the city of St. John, for decades, who proudly presented itself as the Loyalist city of Canada. And you may know that some Loyalists did not only leave with their clothes and possessions, they took their house with them, put it on rafts, cross the waters, and settle like in St. Andrews. New Brunswick, which is so close, and St. Stephen, but mostly St. Andrews, bringing their culture with them. But they were not the first, of course. The planters were the first. And in New Brunswick, in Nova Scotia, and in southern New Brunswick, we also have people at the same time, before the Loyalists, who came from England. They were called the Yorkshire people. They were from York, the region of York. They brought their culture, their way. Of course, they were Anglophones, but they had different Christian beliefs, and they brought some of their furniture, old grandfather clocks. I don't know how they crossed the Atlantic at the time with that, but it's again not exactly well known as the very important Acadian presence in Maine. In the late 19th and early 20th century, where there are so many Acadians, excuse me, that go there to work in the mills. The local newspaper here, L'Evangeline, has so many articles of people in Maine staying there, coming to see their parents in New Brunswick, going back to Maine for the working in the pulp mill industry or in the woods. Excuse me.
But Professor, I'm interested in attitudes towards the English or the Massachusetts Yankees or whatever. Where, it seems to me that from Longfellow's poems and everything, that the Anglophones come across as being far more aggressive than the Francophones, more vicious, we could say.
Yeah, but like there's a big debate. Who started the scalping? Was it a First Nation custom? And we have on both sides here, British in Nova Scotia in the 18th century, the military commander says, "Bring me scalps. You'll get paid for each scalp that you bring in, man, woman, and child. Even white people, bring me Acadian scalps. So I know that you killed those people." French government, French military officers would do the same. We know, and even if we always say it's the British, c'est les Anglais, which is not a synonym for British, that really did the expulsion, but the expulsion were mainly done by men from Massachusetts who were in the local militias. Massachusetts in the 1750 had almost an economic crisis. One of the qualities of the New World was the fact that you could live longer. But if your father does not want to die and he's 70 and 75, he doesn't want to relinquish the control of the household, of the house. And if you're a guy, And if you want to get married, it's hard to get married at the time without a piece of land or a house or at least a building to your name, especially if your father does not want to give it to you until he dies. So especially in the streets of Boston are like not full with these young men, but they're really angry young men. They're frustrated. They don't have a job. They don't have land. So many of them joined the militia, and the lands that they will take from the Acadians can be almost like not a buffer, but like we can send them over there, and they can start anew, and in the same fact add to the British Empire. So again, the the Acadian expulsion is not well understood. It's more complicated than it looks. Massachusetts, Longfellow's grandfather, Stephen, was a member of the House of Assembly of Massachusetts and was known as part of the Acadian lobby. There were many Protestants in the House of Assembly saying, all these Catholics, all these Catholics that are arriving in Massachusetts, they are not like us. They're our enemies. They don't share our religion, but we have to be good Christians. We have to take care of them. So Longfellow with other politicians voted for supplies we have lots of bills for doctors to give. At least you have a more Christian attitude. The separation of families was done like we separate families now. If the state looks at a family that does not take care of their children correctly, the state intervenes and take the children out, put them in homes. So at the time, many of the Acadians were starving, having no work, being in a foreign land. Some of their children were put to work as apprentices in other families. Some of these children grew up as Protestants, lost their culture, became Anglophones. Others came back. Many died, of course, but there's a big there's not like a one-size-fits-all explanation for the Acadian expulsion, and the British, like the French, did not react in the same way. Virginia, for instance, the colonies did not know that Nova Scotia was sending them boats full of these Catholic, which were considered to be rebels. Virginia refused to let them in and paid to send them to England, for instance. So not every colony had the same reception with these refugees. There's a new scholarship now where there are many historians looking as to the early United States as a refugee nation. The Acadians, the Huguenots, the French Protestants from the 16th century, Charleston even later on, and then the Irish in the 19th century, like refugees also for a famine. So how does the local towns that have much power took care of the Acadians? We have lists and everything. It's a really interesting scholarship, the books, the studies that are being published right now on that subject. There's really a new look by a new generation of American scholars of how at least Massachusetts took care of the Acadians when they arrived in 1755.
Does anybody else have any questions or points they'd like to make?
Could I ask a question? It's off subject, but what was the story with Saint Pierre and Miquelon?
Saint Pierre et Miquelon is still a French possession. When Canada was conquered by the British, and finally that conquest was officialized by the Peace Treaty of Paris in 1763, France wanted to keep what was the most profitable economy at the time, not the fur. The fur had fell down like in the early 18th century. It was the fisheries. So it wanted to keep at least one little archipelago for its fishing fleet. And that's how Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon stayed, was conquered by the British. Even the Second World War, we rarely see, like, what did Saint-Pierre say when the French government said, you know, well, we cannot fight the Germans, we will become a Nazi puppet state. Well, there was Churchill wanted to invade Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, but the local prefect said, no, we're rallying to the to de Gaulle, to the free French state that's in exile in London. But there are many Acadians after the expulsion that settled in Saint-Pierre, were deported again. The British conquered, they came back, they stayed a few years. Napoleon comes. Big wars between Britain and France, Acadians on Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, deported again. They come back and they go back and forth. There's a story that I always like to say during the expulsion of Félicité Sia, which is a woman who was born in Acadie before 1755. She was deported with her family to England. She crossed to France. She marries an Acadian. They were part of an expedition to settle a French settlement in the Falklands. They come back from the Falklands to France. They now go to the Gaspé coast to work as fishermen and finally end at Chipagan in northeastern New Brunswick. And I always try to make my students laugh when she says, I imagine that she says to her husband, which is Jean-Baptiste Robichaud, Jean-Baptiste, this is it. You can move somewhere else. I'm staying here. And I say, can you imagine the stories that that woman had for her grandchildren? I've never been to the Falklands. I've never crossed the Atlantic, let again the North Atlantic Ocean, the South Atlantic Ocean. Go back, you know, all these trips. And there's another woman, Jeanne Dugas, with a very interesting comment that many Maine people can share, I believe. A bishop comes to Cape Breton in 1812 from Quebec for a pastoral visit. He meets this old Acadian woman and he talks to her, what are your souvenirs? What did you do, you know, when that, you know, she answers him, which I adore the answer. She said, at least I never went to bed being hungry. That food was important, having you know, to eat and stuff. So she did, I think that she could have said, oh my God, you know, like we died, with children died, it was horrible, but that's, you know, I didn't go to bed hungry one night without having eaten at least.
Wow.
It's,
Can I just ask a quick question?
Of course.
Oh, Professor, where it's so delightful to listen to you. Where can we hear you? You said something about speaking on the radio. Are you on like the CBC or in English?
Yeah.
In French. Is there somewhere we can hear you in English and other places?
Yes, I can send you. I had some participated in some documentaries that are on the web. Okay. So if you can write me to an email and I can send you the links.
If you send them to me, I'll send them to everyone that came tonight.
Cool.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah,
I'll do that in the next.
And I would hope that you had a good time and you'll come back and do another episode for us because this has been fabulous.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add, you know, I also tell my students, I make a jukebox. You put a quarter in and it keeps on playing. You have to unplug it or give it a kick to make it stop. There's a very interesting documentary that was made on St. Croix Island by one of my colleagues at Concordia University in Montreal, Ronald Rudin, and it's in English. I'm part of it. And it's the vision of St. Croix by the Acadians, by the Anglophones, and the Passamaquoddy, looking at what happens in 2004, which is the 400th anniversary of St. Croix. So I'll send you that link. It's free, it's online.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored, and I thank you for your patience, and hopefully you'll come visit us. We have a nice museum on our campus, and I hope to go and have a better knowledge of Maine than Stacy's Country Jamboree.
Thank you, Professor Basque. That was a wonderful presentation, and I thank
Thank you.
everybody for being here and listening to this wonderful talk. And we hope to see you at our next presentation. I don't think we have a plan for that just yet. Do we?
Yes, we do. And Bob is going to be speaking on the Fenian Uprising.
Ah, wait.
And I will send you an invite, Professor.
Oh, yes, we teach that, of course. We teach it as one of the causes of the Canadian Confederation.
Right.
Great. Well, I think on that note, folks, we hope to see you next month for another presentation. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a
Thank
great
you
weekend.
so much.
Thank you.